Now, due to the significance of the summit today, we have decided to go straight into our in-depth news analysis segment and then touch back on the rest of the day's headlines later. And also due to the fact that our expert guest is here with us now in the studio as well to provide us with his reaction analysis to the Yoon Biden summit, I'm honoured to say that Ahn Ho-young, the former ambassador to the United States during the Park Geun-hye administration, has joined us now. He now serves as the president of the University of North Korean Studies here in Seoul. Ambassador Ahn, thank you for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
First off, what's your overall assessment of the bilateral summit between President Yoon and President Biden? What were the two sides looking to get out of it, do you think? And do you think they got what they wanted?
I think so. And, I've seen a large number of summit meetings between Korea and then the United States, of course, because I spent so many years in the Korean Foreign Service. And then I was watching this one, and I think it was a very impressive summit meeting in two respects. First of all, because it in fact has a very strong symbolic significance, but at the same time, a large number of important agreements on substantive issues. So what I mean by symbolic significance is, this year marks the 70th anniversary of the alliance between Korea and then the United States. And then what is the meaning of 70 years? All that the development of industrialization, democratization, etc., etc. And I think you are familiar with American journalist, columnist. His name is David Ignatius. And personally, I think he's the most influential columnist in the United States today.
Okay.
And then he wrote yesterday about this visit. And then he called Korea's development over the past 70 years as epic achievement, epic success. And then I have heard large number of descriptions describing Korea's development as a nation. But this, in fact, is the strongest compliment for what Korea has been doing. And then, of course, much of it, in fact, has been based upon security provided by Security Alliance. So I think this, state visit offered by President Biden, I think it was a very appropriate symbolic event signifying the importance of 70 years of alliance between Korea and then the United States. And then when it comes to, the progress we made in substance, of course, we can go through them one by one.
Sure, indeed. Korea's growth has, of course, been epic, to say the least. And of course, the US has been a key partner during that time as well. Let's talk, as you said, more detail about some of the more substantive outcomes of the summit. Arguably, the Washington Declaration, under which the countries will set up a nuclear consultative group, has gotten the main headlines, of course. The consultative group, according to US officials, will be similar to NATO's nuclear policy planning body, the Nuclear Planning Group. The declaration also includes the frequent deployment of nuclear-powered submarines to South Korea as well. Ambassador, what did you make of this declaration, and how is it perhaps different from previous extended deterrence measures and agreements, such as during the administrations of former President Barack Obama and Lee Myung-bak? Opposition lawmakers have criticized it, saying that it's no different from existing U.S. Nuclear umbrella policy.
When North Korea, in fact, tested nuclear weapons or missiles, then United States responded in its own way. And that definitely is going to change in the days to come. Why? Because that is what is going to happen on the nuclear consultative group, in the sense that, in my mind, there are two key expressions in that NCG. The first keyword is joint planning. The second keyword is joint execution. So I think one of the reasons why many South Korean citizens, in fact, were not assured about the kind of extended deterrence offered by the United States was because many Koreans thought we don't have any say. It is just a kind of something being offered by the United States. We don't have any influence upon what the United States does or doesn't do. That, in fact, is going to change because of this NCG. So that, I think, is the biggest significance of this new institution, new group, that we are going to establish between Korea and then the United States.
Right, so it's an opportunity for Koreans to have their say, but some have said, although US officials have compared it to NATO's nuclear planning group, the name suggests that group has some say in the planning, whereas this is just the nuclear consultative group, where it's just consulting and not necessarily involved in the planning. What do you say to that criticism?
Well, a nuclear planning group, it has been there for a couple of decades now. And then NCG, we are just launching it. So I don't think we can compare it. But at the same time, as I already told you, I read Washington Declaration, and it clearly says one of the things which is going to happen on the NCG, that is joint planning. So planning definitely is going to be part of what NCG does. And then I think it will depend upon what we do. When I say we, then of course Korea and United States, what we do in further utilizing this NCG, that in fact, of course, would be decide how effective the system will be. Because agreeing upon a group is important, but at the same time, making full use of that grouping is even more important in my mind.
As we also covered in our news briefing earlier, the declaration seems to have been reached with the understanding that South Korea will no longer pursue its own nuclear armament, calls of which have grown in recent months. Do you think that this will end the talk of such calls and reassure the South Korean public that the US commitment to defend South Korea from nuclear threats is real, which is why these calls arose, of course?
Well, there has been a large number of opinion poll surveys in Korea. And then some of the opinion polls showed more than 70% of South Koreans want a nuclear option. Some others suggesting more than 60%, etc., etc. So what they are saying is, where South Koreans, they are highly concerned about the level of threat that is coming from North Korea. So I think what is important for government leaders, both in Korea and United States, is to come up with certain measure which will go a long way in assuring South Korean citizens how committed they are to offer this extended deterrence to South Korea. And I think this, NCG, as well as deployment of strategic assets around Korea more often in the days to come, they definitely will go a long way in providing that level of assurance to hopefully large number of South Korean citizens. But at the same time, talking about 70%, 60%, I think some of them would continue to have the concerns. That, of course, wouldn't be surprising at all.
What do you think North Korea will make of these developments? For example, the establishment of the NCG, the frequent deployment of nuclear-powered submarines to South Korea?
Well, this is what we have observed about North Korea since after the Hanoi collapse of the Hanoi summit in February 2019. And then after that, then of course, North Korea has been boycotting any offer of diplomacy, any offer of dialogue coming from United States, coming from South Korea. And then they, in fact, have been going all the way to further strengthen its nuclear as well as missile capability. And I think North Korea will continue to do that. But at the same time, we have to understand that North Korea, by doing that, in fact, is increasing its vulnerability. When I say vulnerability, then of course North Korean economy, it in fact is crumbling. When it has spent more than 25% of its GDP on the military, then that is not surprising. And then that in fact is feeding into high level of the dissatisfaction in the North Korean society about the whole arrangement. And that I think would be leading to what I often say, Gorbachev moment. Because that, in fact, is what was happening in the Soviet Union in 1970s and 1980s. Soviet Union didn't collapse because they didn't have nuclear weapons. It collapsed because they, in fact, came to find, Soviet economy and then Soviet level of life and Soviet level of citizen satisfaction about their own system, they, in fact, were not sustainable. And then it was because of that Soviet Union disintegrated and collapsed. And then that, in fact, is what happened in the Soviet Union. And I'm pretty sure that that Gorbachev moment could be coming in North Korea as well.
in the meantime, should we be bracing for more provocations from North Korea?
Exactly. That's why we need to further strengthen extended deterrence.
Well, we wait to see what reaction will come from North Korea and what this will do for tensions on the peninsula. But for now, the South Korea-U.S. alliance looks particularly ironclad, as they like to say, on the security front. Let's talk about some of the other issues now. One of the major talking points ahead of the summit was what headway President Yoon will be able to make on economic issues. The U.S. CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, both aimed at reshoring and realigning the global supply chain away from China, of course, have negatively affected Korean car, battery and chip makers. So the summit was watched closely to see whether President Yoon could get any concessions to at least alleviate the situation at all. The leaders promised further consultations, but seems to have made little headway on that matter. Do you think this would have been disappointing for Korean industries affected? And what effort do you think the Yoon administration will need to make to improve the situation?
Well, both legislations, IRA as well as CHIPS and Science Act, they passed U.S. Congress, I guess, August last year. And then since then, there has been steady process of consultation between, government officials of our two countries. And I think we have been making important headway in trying to, in a sense, understand what the impact is going to be, and in order to alleviate the negative impact upon Korean industries. So we have been making the progress. And this summit meeting, in fact, is taking place against that background. And with respect to that, then this morning I was reading this joint statement between President Yoon and then President Biden. And then what it said was that, the two leaders appreciated the progress which has been made between two governments on these issues. So I just was asking myself, what is the meaning of appreciation? And I think what impact it will have upon government officials who have been, conducting all these discussions. And as I understand it, there have been many positive progress which has been made through those consultations. And I'm just putting myself in the position of government officials in Korea and then the United States.
Right.
When our leaders meet and then they say, I appreciate what you have been doing, I think it will be received by, government officials, both in Korea and the United States, as a kind of endorsement of those all those efforts which have made so far. So I'm pretty confident that it will have a very positive impact upon how those laws are going to be implemented in the days to come.
Sure, but it looks like more time will be needed then to perhaps resolve this issue more quickly, and more discussions needed, essentially.
But some of them are already being felt. And then the example would be, for example, talking about the IRA, then there is a condition which is the subsidy will be provided only for the cars manufactured in North America. But at the same time, there is an exception, right? Exception for rent vehicles and then lease vehicles, which in fact about 30% of the whole market. And then that in fact is being taken advantage of. And then at the same time, I think it was a couple of weeks ago that the Department of Treasury came up with a guideline about what it means by 50% material condition and then 40% part condition. And then as I understand it, the way it was written, the way the guideline was written, it in fact was favorable for Korean manufacturers of batteries in the United States. So all of them are in fact taking place. All those discussions have been taking place so far. And then this endorsement, appreciation coming from the two leaders, I definitely think they will expedite the whole process.
Let's talk about one more issue. Before President Yoon headed off to the US, there were some diplomatic disputes that had arisen with China and Russia over comments the president made about Ukraine and Taiwan. President Yoon hinted that South Korea could provide support to Ukraine beyond humanitarian and economic aid, i.e. military aid, should the country come under a large-scale attack on civilians or suffer a massacre. Russia railed against such a suggestion, saying it would be an act of hostility. Yoon also opposed any attempts to change the status quo by force in the Taiwan Strait, which drew an angry response from China. So while the Yoon administration has tried to temper the situation since then, and there were limited references to both situations in the joint statements and press conference, there was enough to make clear that the Yoon government will side with the U.S. On Ukraine and Taiwan issues. So what are your thoughts on this situation? Is the administration departing from its policy of strategic ambiguity when it comes to Russia and China that it's had before and moving perhaps towards, should we say, strategic clarity by strengthening ties with the US?
Well, Mr. Kwon, it's a very lengthy question you're posing to me.
Just wanted to provide the background for our listeners, well, just in case.
But at the same time, I certainly understand why you are posing the question to me, and I think my question would have to be equally long. So at least I think I should be making 3 points.
Okay.
And then my first point would be this, which is that where we often talk about so-called four-power diplomacy, the four powers meaning United States, Japan, China, and Russia. And I think the first point about four-power diplomacy should be Korea must continue to cooperate with them, with all four of them, because of geopolitical as well as geoeconomic reality around the Korean Peninsula. That's for sure. We must continue to cooperate with them. The second point would be, but even then, among those four powers, then of course, all this relationship with those four powers, in fact, would have to be built upon alliance with the United States, for obvious reason, in the sense that that definitely is a country with which we share liberal democracy, values of liberal democracy, as well as our belief in rule-based international order, as well as our security alliance. So all the relationship would have to be built upon this, alliance with the United States, which is 70 years old now. And then my third point would be this, which is that cooperation, our desire to continue to cooperate with all the four powers, it doesn't mean we will acquiesce with everything that they say or that they do. Sometimes we'll have to speak out. And then we, in fact, have been discussing about IRA, we have been discussing about the CHIPS Act with the United States, and then we spoke out on those issues. And then with Japan, then of course we, again, make a lot of efforts in order to overcome the issues of history between Korea and Japan. I think same thing is happening in our relationship with Russia, in our relationship with China, in the sense that what did President Yoon say? What he said was that, well, massacre of civilian population or violation of wartime humanitarian law, that's not acceptable. And, change of status quo with use of force, that's not acceptable. And then, as a matter of fact, that in fact is what I would call strategic clarity. Without that strategic clarity, then strategic ambiguity, what would strategic ambiguity, where would it lead us to? I think it would lead us to, say, loss of credibility between Korea and United States, and eventually loss of credibility between Korea and China as well, between Korea and Russia as well. Why? Because at the end of the day, we will have to make decisions based upon our values as a nation, liberal democracy, right? And then, if we make that decision at the very end, then, I think the impression Russia will have, the impression China will have would be, we have been duped. Korea, it has been silent all the way, and then was showing as if it can go along with us. Sure. But at the very end, then it is stabbing us in the back. So that way, we'll be losing credibility even with Russia and China. So I think strategic clarity should be the answer.
Still, his comments ruffled quite a few feathers. As a former ambassador, would you have any advice for the Yoon administration, if not to improve, say, relations with Moscow and Beijing, but to manage it and maintain it?
Well, in a sense, I already made the point, in the sense that the first point we have to make to Russia and China is that we, in fact, wish to cooperate with you. We wish to work with you, right? That's the first point. And second point would be, but we will have to do it upon the values of Korea as a nation. That's to say, liberal democracy and rule-based international order. We cannot depart from that. So we will cooperate with you, but on that basis.
So we have to stick to our guns, you're saying?
In a sense, consistency in our position, in our foreign and security policy.
Okay, and finally, let's wrap things up by saying how you think relations with South Korea and the United States will continue from here on out as well.
Well, we in fact celebrated 70 years of alliance. And then this morning, I was reading this joint statement between President Yoon and then President Biden. And then I was very positively impressed about the whole structure, not only the contents of the statement, but about the whole structure of the statement. It started with global issues, and then it went on to Indo-Pacific issues. Only after that, after discussing about global issues, about Indo-Pacific issues, and only then it began to talk about bilateral issues, which I think was very different, which is very different from the joint statement we used to have so far. Because we started with bilateral issues, and then we moved on to regional issues, and only then we moved to global issues. You can check with all the joint statements for previous meetings. But somehow I think there was an intention on the part of both Korea and United States about Korea by now should be, in a sense, standing up. And then will meet certain, responsibilities as a global pivotal state, GPS. And then that, I think, was reflected in the joint statement. So I think there are three things that we must be sticking to as we plan 70 years of our alliance in the days to come. First, we should be clear about the vision, and that vision should be Korea, playing the role, well, in a sense, commensurate with its capabilities. That should be the vision. And second, we must fill that vision with certain substance. And then the substance, of course, should be multi-layered. Security relationship, economic relationship. And then by now, I'm thinking the most important layer, which must be further strengthened for the time being between Korea and the United States, that's in the area of science and technology. Because science and technology, I think there has been dazzling development of science and technology recently. And then when I hear about all those developments we are making in, say, AI, machine learning, quantum computing, etc., then, of course, I'm encouraged about all those positive use to which all those developments could be put to. But at the same time, I'm concerned. I cannot be concerned about certain dire consequences which could arise when they're used for certain negative purposes. So if there is one area, one layer of relationship which should be further strengthened between Korea and the United States, I think there is science and technology. Third point, this is an important point, which is that we must in fact continue to be mindful of further strengthening confidence between the two countries, because alliance is not sustainable without high level of confidence between each other.
Well, we're going to have to wrap it up there, but Ambassador, thank you so much for sharing your time with us so fully, and we appreciate all your thoughts on these matters today. We've been speaking with the former ambassador to the US, Ambassador Ahn Ho-young. Thank you once again for your time today.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kwon.